Imagine the heartbreaking, gut-wrenching anguish of suddenly losing someone you love in the most devastating and tragic of circumstances. Spending more than 30 years fighting for answers and for the truth of what happened, for justice for the one you lost, only to be stonewalled and told records vital to any investigation have been sealed away for, wait for it, 100 years, and then denied the opportunity to find out what really happened by a Prime Minister who had promised you transparency and accountability. It's unimaginable, isn't it?
Good evening. An RAF Chinook helicopter with 29 people on board has crashed in the west of Scotland.
The Chinook helicopter was flying from Northern Ireland to Scotland in 1994. There were 29 people on board, including army and intelligence officers, when it crashed on the Mull of Kintyre. All lost their lives. 3 decades on, their families are calling for a public inquiry.
I was just 7 years old when I lost my father. My younger brother and sister were 2. I just remember there was a knock on the door. It was a colleague of my father's, and they just said, "Is your mummy in?" And I remember in that moment, I just had this sinking feeling. I just knew something terrible had happened.
It was one of the RAF's worst peacetime losses of life.
Those passengers went to work one day and they come home 4 days later in a box. We don't know. We don't know all the circumstances, the truth behind it. There hasn't been transparency, and there's a lot of revelations now. People are coming forward, and we feel we need to know, we deserve to know.
Last year, a BBC documentary highlighted concerns over the Chinook's airworthiness. MOD documents passed to the BBC, one written 9 months before the crash, detailed serious concerns about the helicopter's computer software, describing it as positively dangerous.
We are all extremely confident that the aircraft was not airworthy. It was grounded by the RAF engineers who weren't allowed to fly it, and deemed positively dangerous and not to be trusted.
The 2 pilots, Jonathan Tappert and Richard Cook, were initially blamed for flying too low and too fast. But after a long legal campaign by their families, they were exonerated.
I think it's time that the MOD came out with the truth.
Major Chris Doherty was one of several intelligence officers on the flight. His sister Nicola is among those calling for answers.
Who gave the order to allow 29 people to go onto an unairworthy aircraft? That is the question I would like asked. Why did my brother, along with 28 others, board an aircraft that highly trained MOD test pilots were ordered not to fly?
More than 3 decades on, the cause of the crash is still unknown.
A Chinook helicopter that crashed in Scotland more than 30 years ago, killing 29 people, was being flown as a show flight to prove to the army it was safe, according to a former RAF test pilot. Families of those who died in the crash have renewed their call for a full public inquiry into what went wrong.
A former test pilot has told BBC Scotland there were serious concerns at the time that this new type of Chinook, the Mark II, was not airworthy, and this was a show flight by the Royal Air Force to prove otherwise.
The RAF wanted to demonstrate that the aircraft was safe and they could put their most trusted and valuable list of passengers in the context of the security operation in Northern Ireland on board altogether. What a silly decision.
Robert Burke had been a test pilot at the time.
There were obviously major faults with that aircraft. However, the Mark II was sent to Northern Ireland as a gesture by the RAF to show that everything was sorted.
If my dad had have known any of those individuals had been told, look, this helicopter hasn't got a good track record, none of them would have got on it.
The Prime Minister has rejected calls for a public inquiry.
In a letter to the families, the Prime Minister has said he does not believe that a new inquiry can bring any greater certainty or is in the public interest.
The Prime Minister's decision has been slammed by campaigners.
We've asked the Prime Minister to jump in and actually give us a public inquiry, because currently we're going to have to go down the legal route. We've asked him, he responded yesterday, he's rejected that request. He's basically, on one hand in the letter, stated that the government are committed to transparency and accountability, but on the other hand slammed the door straight in our face and said this is not something that we can get. And personally, I found it quite pathetic, the response, and it shows a complete lack of moral leadership from our Prime Minister, and we've completely lost faith in our government and our Prime Minister because of it.
The Prime Minister says it's unlikely a full public inquiry would identify any new evidence or reach new conclusions. The family's lawyer disagrees.
Incredible that 31 years on, we still haven't looked at what was known about the airworthiness of that particular aircraft. It's been excluded from all the previous inquiries. And indeed, when there was a crash in Afghanistan some years ago, they did include the airworthiness of the plane within the terms of reference. But that's been excluded in relation to these families.
The Prime Minister promised transparency and accountability in public office.
In relation to the tragic cases that she raises, firstly, I thank her for raising them, and it is important that we have a legal duty of candour. We will be introducing that because, as she says, there must be the truth here based on all people being dealt with on the basis of dignity, fairness and accountability. Thank you.
But this refusal to allow a public inquiry is the exact opposite of what he promised. In fact, it's an outright refusal to be transparent and accountable. And think about this. What could possibly be so sensitive that it needs to stay sealed for 100 years, denying grieving families the opportunity to know the truth of the tragic circumstances that led to the loss of their loved ones, and to give them the justice and closure we all know they deserve?
Like I said, I want to set a good example to my children, that you stand up for people, stand up to people who are bullying you, essentially, and not giving you the truth and transparency that we deserve. And, you know, like I said, all the families are committed to keep fighting, and we will continue to do so until the end.
Those that died served their country, and they and their families now deserve honesty and transparency and justice from this government. So please help them break 3 decades of silence by signing their petition, calling on the Prime Minister to hold a judge-led public inquiry and allow them access to the documents which have now been sealed for 100 years. 100 years! It only takes a moment to sign the petition, and you'll find a link with this film. The MOD has been allowed to mark its own homework on this tragic crash for 31 years. Let's now help the families achieve the justice we all know they deserve.